On the night of March 17th, 1943, Captain Lieutenant Friedrich Guggenberger brought U-81 to the surface in North Atlantic and told his crew something that most submarine commanders of any nation, in any war, had never said to men who had just survived what they had survived. He told them he understood if they did not want to go down again. The previous 19 hours had been the most sustained ordeal that any of the 44 men aboard had experienced in 3 years of war. 3 separate Allied convoy escort groups had tracked U-81 through a night and a morning and into the afternoon, following hydrophone contacts and oil slicks and the thermal traces that a diesel submarine leaves in cold water even when running silent. 3 times the depth charges had come. The first pattern catching them at 80 meters and sending them deeper into a crash dive that brought the hull to creaking stress at 190 meters. The second finding them there and blowing out the aft torpedo room flooding valve and sending seawater into compartment before damage control teams could reach it. The third arriving when they had risen toward the surface in hopes of a gap in the coverage and driving them back into the deep with a concussion that ruptured 2 fuel cells and left a visible trail on the surface that told the escorts exactly where they were. In the hours between the attacks, the crew had done what submarine crews do in those hours. They had lain in their bunks fully clothed. They had conserved every breath of oxygen in the air that was their only resource. They had listened to the pinging of the ASDIC sonar above them and counted the seconds between each ping and tried to calculate from the changing intervals whether the ship producing it was getting closer or farther away. They had held each other's eyes in the dim emergency lighting and not spoken of what they were thinking, because what they were thinking was something that no man in a sealed steel tube at 190 meters of depth can afford to think clearly. When Guggenberger surfaced after midnight, after the last escort had lost contact and moved on, and when the hatches opened and the men in the conning tower breathed air that tasted of salt and diesel and the immense cold of the North Atlantic, several of his men began to cry. Not in grief, in the involuntary release of something that the body cannot hold and cannot process while survival is still the only available task. Guggenberger wrote in his war diary that night of passage to the superiors in the BDU were found professionally inappropriate if they had read it in the spirit it was written. He noted that his crew had performed their duties with extraordinary competence under conditions that exceeded the design parameters of both the vessel and human endurance. He noted that several men had asked, during the surface recovery period, whether it would be possible to request a different assignment upon returning to base. And he noted that he had told them he would support any such request, and that he considered the asking of it not a failure of courage, but an honest assessment of what they had been through and what they understood about what came next. The request his crew made when they reached Loria, not for transfer save for duty, which most were too proud to ask officially, but for something stranger and more specific, is the story this video is about. It is a story about what repeated mortal terror does to human beings who survive it, about the limits of institutional systems that cannot acknowledge those limits without losing their purpose, and about the specific way that men who have been to the deepest places of fear sometimes try to return to something ordinary enough to remind them they are still human. The U-boat arm of the German Navy was, for a specific period between 1939 and early 1943, the most feared naval force in the world. The men who served in it were not conscripts filling a quota. They were volunteers, selected through a process rigorous enough that acceptance rates rarely exceeded 30% of applicants, trained to standards that the German Naval High Command considered the most demanding in any branch of service. They knew what they were volunteering for. The casualty statistics from World War I, when the U-boat campaign had consumed the crews who prosecuted it almost as thoroughly as the crews of the Allied ships they sank, were not secret. They were part of the professional culture of the service. What distinguished the U-boat culture of the early war period was a collective mythology of invulnerability that the operational results appeared to support. In the happy time of 1940 and 1941, U-boats were returning to their French Atlantic bases with pennants flying to indicate kills, their commanders being decorated by Dönitz himself on the dock, their crews being celebrated in newsreels and propaganda films that the German public consumed with the avidity of people who needed heroes and were being given them in industrial quantity. The men who were dying invisibly, their boats simply not returning, their fate reported to families in the brief official notifications that the Navy had standardized into administrative efficiency. The psychology that this culture produced in the surviving crews was, in retrospect, something that psychiatrists would later recognize as a form of denial that was simultaneously functional and fragile. Functional because it allowed men to continue doing an operationally necessary and genuinely dangerous job. Fragile because it rested on a premise that the skill and training and luck that had kept them alive so far would continue to keep them alive, that became progressively harder to maintain as the Allied anti-submarine systems improved and the losses mounted. The improvement in Allied anti-submarine capability was not gradual. It was stepwise, relatively stable at one level, then jumping to a new level as a technological or tactical innovation was fielded, then stable again. Each step change produced a corresponding step change in German U-boat losses that the crews experienced directly, through the non-return of boats from their patrol areas, through the increased frequency of close attacks that damaged boats that had previously operated in relative comfort, and through the accumulating testimony of the small number who survived being depth charged to the point of surfacing and capture. What the crews were experiencing in 1942 and 1943 was not simply increased danger. It was a specific kind of sustained psychological pressure that the medical literature of the time called Nervenerschütterung, literally shattering of the nerves, and that the modern literature calls combat stress reaction, or PTSD. The symptoms were consistent across survivors and consistent with what combat psychiatrists in every subsequent conflict have documented. Hypervigilance, intrusive recall, sleep disruption characterized by repetitive dreams of the worst moments, the inability to perform previously automatic tasks without conscious effort, and a progressive dissociation from the camaraderie that had sustained performance in earlier periods. The U-boat arms institutional response to these symptoms was shaped by a command culture that had no framework for acknowledging them without acknowledging what caused them, and acknowledging what caused them would have required acknowledging that the campaign was no longer what had been presented to men who volunteered for it. Dönitz's response to increasing losses was to increase operational tempo, to keep the boats at sea longer, to send them to more distant operating areas, to maintain the patrol pressure that the calculations of the tonnage war required, not to reduce the demands on men who were reaching their limits. The strange request that Guggenberger's crew made when they returned to Loria in the spring of 1943 was this. They asked for a week, not official leave, but of work, specifically of physical work in the yards, helping with the repair and maintenance of the boats that were returning damaged. They did not want rest, which their superiors would have considered the appropriate response to what they had been through. They wanted to do something with their hands that was concrete and bounded and completely within human control. They wanted to tighten bolts and replace gaskets and paint hull sections and carry tools from one place to another. They wanted to be surrounded by the smell of metal and grease rather than the smell of salt water and diesel. They wanted to hear the sound of hammers on steel rather than depth charges on hull. Guggenberger supported the request. The base commander, after some administrative negotiation about how to classify the labor deployment, approved it for 7 days. The crew of U-81 worked in the repair yard alongside the civilian mechanics and naval artificers who maintained the boats between patrols. The base doctor who observed them during this period and who noted what he saw in a report that was filed and largely forgotten until it was recovered by researchers after the war, wrote something that was, for a military medical document of its era, unusually perceptive. The men, he wrote, were not recovering from their ordeal by resting. They were recovering by doing something that reminded them of the world they had come from, the world of ordinary labor and ordinary purpose, where what you built stayed built, and what you fixed stayed fixed, and the problem you solved in the morning was not the same problem attacking you in the afternoon. They needed, he concluded, to remember what competence felt like when the stakes were ordinary. The request that Guggenberger's crew made was, in the institutional language of the BDU, unusual but not unprecedented. There was a category in the administrative structure for short-term assignment to base duties between patrols, and the request fit within this category without requiring anyone to document the psychological reality that had produced it. The men got their week in the yard. They returned to sea. Several of them survived the war, but the pattern that their request represented was one that was repeating itself across the U-boat arm in ways that the institutional structure was progressively less able to contain. By the summer of 1943, after Black May had demonstrated conclusively that the tactical balance in the Atlantic had shifted permanently against the submarine, Dönitz was sending boats back to see that he knew had crew members who were not operationally ready by any honest psychological standard. The institutional pressure to maintain patrol density, to keep the boats at sea, to support the political fiction that the campaign was continuing effectively, overrode the professional knowledge that men who had been through what these men had been through were not the men who had volunteered in 1940. The mortality rate in the U-boat arm after Black may have reflected this reality with brutal arithmetic. Boats that returned from the summer of 1943 patrols brought back crews whose descriptions of their experiences, recorded in the post-patrol debriefings that the BDU required, read like clinical documents of dissociation. Men who could not remember sequences of events they had participated in. Men who described time during depth charge attacks as having become nonlinear, as if the explosion and the silence and the next explosion were not connected in normal temporal sequence, but were arriving simultaneously from different directions. Men who described making correct technical decisions during emergencies, without being able to explain afterward how those decisions had been made. One patrol commander, whose debrief is preserved in the BDU records of the German Federal Military Archive, described the psychological state of his crew during their return transit in terms that his debrief officer recorded without comment, but that no one who reads them now can interpret as anything other than a crew that had exceeded its human limits. "Half my men," the commander wrote, "have stopped being afraid." This sounds like courage. It is not courage. It is a thing that comes after fear, when fear has been sustained long enough. I do not know what to call it, but I know that men in this state do not make the decisions that keep themselves and their boat alive. They make decisions that are correct in every technical sense and that reflect a complete indifference to whether the decision results in survival. I am bringing them back because that is my duty. I am not confident about what happens when they go out again. He was right to lack confidence. His boat sailed on its next patrol in September 1943. It did not return. The strange request of Guggenberger's crew was, at its core, a request for something that the military system they served had no official category for, a way to be human again without formally requesting the right to stop being soldiers. A week of boats and paint and physical labor was not therapy. It was not treatment. It was not rest. It was a specific thing that specific men who had been in a specific kind of fear for a specific period of time needed. The experience of doing ordinary work in ordinary conditions and having the ordinary results that ordinary work produces. The base doctor understood this. Guggenberger understood this. The men who asked for it understood it in the way that people understand what they need without being able to explain why they need it. What neither the doctor nor the commander nor the men could change was a structure they were operating within. A structure that needed men who would go back into submarines, that had no mechanism for honestly acknowledging the human cost of what was asking them to do, and that could not extend the week of ordinary work into the longer period of ordinary living that the deepest cases would have required. The U-boat arm lost approximately 28,000 of its 40,000 men during the war, a casualty rate of 70% that has no equivalent in the record of any military service branch in any conflict of the modern era. The men who survived came home to a country that was itself in ruins, and carried with them experiences that the psychiatric vocabulary of 1945 was not equipped to name, and that the social culture of post-war Germany was not equipped to receive. Most of them did not talk about it. The things that happen at 190 meters in the dark, with depth charges arriving in sequences that the body cannot distinguish from death. These were not things that ordinary language in ordinary times could hold. A week in a repair yard with a wrench and a paintbrush was not enough. But it was what they asked for, and it was within the constraints of what was possible, what they were given. And something about the simplicity of that request, for the most ordinary thing imaginable, for work that stayed done, for problems that stayed solved, for the specific ordinariness of a hammer on steel rather than seawater through a hull valve, says more about what the U-boat campaign cost its own men than any casualty figure has ever managed to convey. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.